Welcome to this video about positional play. This video is based on step 3 of the steps method, and a lot of players have difficulty when there are no direct threats in the position to find moves to improve their position. And in the step method there are two central elements. One is activity and the other one is vulnerability. So the whole positional strategy is based on increasing your own activity, reducing the activity of your opponent, exploiting vulnerabilities of your opponent, and reducing your own vulnerabilities. So I'm going to spend 1 minute on these slides, and you can find them back in the text of the video. So activity is, of course, when a piece has a lot of possible moves, and if it's operating in a center, it's attacking something, and also very important is that it's cooperating with other pieces. And then when we talk about the center, right, in the step method, the center is squares d4, d5, e4, e5, and then the adjacent squares, so from c3 to f6 are called the central squares in the step method. And notice that when you have a knight, that any knight which is outside the center and the central squares has not 8 squares to go to, but is limited. So you can see already from this picture that a knight in the center is the only place where the knight has actually 8 moves. And the more moves a piece has, the more influence it has. How can you increase activity? Bring all your pieces into the game. So don't roam around with your queen eating all the pawns of your opponent, but bring them all into play, improve the cooperation, and so on. Let's go to the vulnerability side. So you can have vulnerable pieces, right? When they're almost trapped, a queen can be vulnerable because it can be chased. When it's tied up to defending, when it's pinned. And of course there are typical vulnerabilities in general. So you can have a damaged pawn structure. In the opening it's f7 and many times the e8, h5 diagonal, especially when black has moved their pawns. A king in the middle can be a vulnerability, so you can open lines to attack the king. And of course, if the pawn structure in front of the king has been compromised, that is also a vulnerability. And in general, you have to look for targets, for vulnerabilities that are hard to defend. So the idea is that you provoke weaknesses and then attack the weaknesses. And you can really compare this to mobilizing your army, going to war, and you want your whole army involved and cooperating well, and then you want to create weaknesses in the enemy's camp and then target those weaknesses and attack them. So let's now go to ChessBase and look at examples. So white is to move in this position, and in all cases you can see who's to move by looking at the dot next to the square h1. So take a moment and think about what is going on. So we see, of course, that here the pawn structure in the front of the black's king has been damaged. But if you would talk to your pieces, you would hear that the bishop on f3 would say, I would like to have a better position, and if I could dream, what would be my dream square? My dream square would be f5. And we can get there by playing the move bishop g4. And now you can see there's a queen under attack. So the fact that the queen can be chased means that we can increase the activity of our own pieces with tempo. And this momentum is very important in chess. So the queen has to go away. Then we move to f5 with the idea to play queen h5, right, and queen h7 checkmate. So you can also see, of course, black doesn't have a wide squared bishop, so this is very dangerous. But black has a defense, so knight e7, the queen comes to h5, this powerful bishop gets traded. But then we activate our rook, right? So you can see it's all about activating your pieces and bringing them to the king side and attacking the king. So this is the first example. Let's go to the next example. So in this case, what's going on? If you would do the orientation, the bishop on g5 is spinning the knight on f6. Black is missing their pawn on f7, so we have a pin. And black has a compromised pawn structure close to their king. So how can we activate our pieces? Well, again, if you would talk to your pieces and you would ask this bishop, what would be your dream square in this position? So you don't think about your move, but you think like, if I could get there, that would be fantastic. And then you figure out if there's a way to get there and what the route is. And then, of course, you say, I would really like to be on e6 in the enemy camp, attack the king. And because of this vulnerability of the pin of the bishop on g5, that's good cooperation between the two bishops. White has to move bishop g4 because the knight on f6 cannot take the bishop. And let's just see the threat by white, right? a6. Now the bishop is in the enemy camp, right? So it used to be on e2. It's in the enemy camp, attacking the king. And if the king moves away, then white takes on h7, makes a hole in the defense of the king, and brings another attacker, and mates the black king. Of course, there are other moves that black can play, but it started out with activating the bishop. The bishop was on e2, the dream square was e6, and it was possible, because of the vulnerabilities in black's position, to play bishop g4, bishop e6. And if black would not defend very accurately, it would lead to a mating attack, because also of the compromised pawn structure in front of the black king. The pawn on f7 was missing. So in this case, right, if you would say, what is the dream square of this knight on f3? Well, the knight would be much better, right, on f5, attacking the king and also eyeing all those squares, right? So again, currently this knight is on the white side of the board, on the third rank. We bring the knight to the fifth rank, and we start to attack points in the camp of the enemy. And also notice, of course, that this bishop on d5 is pinning the knight, and this bishop is pinning also the knight. So let me try to remove all those arrows. And then, when we have figured out our dream square, we can say, can we get there? And in this case, we can play knight h4. And black can say, I'm going to prevent you from getting to f5, and plays g6. Of course, g6 is weakening the pawn structure in front of the black king. And now we can activate another piece by f4, right? So part of increasing the activity is also increasing the tension. So we go back to the beginning, right? So here you could say, well, right, there's not too much tension. There are two pins, but actually the tension is not so high. But white, right, is playing knight h4, forces black to react. So again, the momentum is on the white side, and then brings their rook into the game by playing f4 and threatening to take on e5, right? And then there would be a second attacker on the knight on f6. The bishop would be attacking that knight, and the rook on f1 would be attacking that knight. And the pressure on the black position has become so big that black is immediately lost. So in general, when you look at bishops and rooks, they need space because they have long legs. And so we'd like to remove pawns in front of them so they can exercise their long legs and they can show their true potential. So in this case, we play f4, and by playing f4, we open the f file and we activate the rook. So far, right, we can see also how vulnerabilities and increasing activity go hand in hand. In this case, right, take a moment to think what is going on. And would you activate a knight, or is something else going on? And what I notice is that when I look at this position, I feel that there is, you could say, an indirect attack of this rook, like an X-ray attack. It's indirect on both f7 and the queen on f6. And like in the previous game, right, then we have cooperation with the other piece. Like in the previous game, rooks would like to have open files to operating on, and we can play the move f4, and now the threat of f takes e5, followed by rook takes f7 or bishop takes f7 with a discovered attack is already too strong. So both for the rooks and the bishops, we would like to open lines so they can show their true power. So in this case, let's see what's going on. We have an undefended bishop on b5, right? But if black was to move, black would like to play knight takes d5 and get rid of the twofold attack at the moment by the bishop and the knight. So what to do, right? And so you can trade on f6 yourself, trade the pieces and reduce the tension. You could play knight e to c3, right? Or you can increase the tension and also exploit the vulnerability of the queen on e6. And how can you increase your activity and build the tension in this position? And the move to do that is by bishop b3. So if you have more space and you are attacking, you don't want to trade and reduce tension, you want to build the tension. And after bishop b3, the threat is knight takes f6 with a discovered attack on the queen on e6. And again, in this position, black does not have a defense anymore. Relatively best is giving up an exchange, right? Because now this bishop is having a double attack on the rook on a8 and the bishop on e6. So very crucial is to build up the tension and not to trade. And you can see the difference, right? Now I allow black to trade. And now you can see that the tension is much lower than in the previous example. The knight on d5 is under attack. Black is able to trade some pieces, and because of those trades, the tension goes down. But if you are in an attacking situation, you like to build tension, calculate well, and then that can lead to a win. So let's see what's going on. So part of the whole strategy, right? You see it's increasing activity, improving cooperation, exploiting vulnerabilities, but also damaging the pawn structure. So in this case, black is to move, and black has a discovered attack on the queen on d4, right? There are a knight on f6 and a bishop on g7, and they're looking down to the queen on d4. And we can damage the pawn structure by playing knight e4, attacking the queen. The queen moves away, right? So knight e4, queen is under attack. Queen moves away. We take on c3, and after b takes c3, right, the pawn structure of white has been damaged, and black can start attacking it by playing knight d7, rook c8, and then bringing attackers to this pawn on c4. And in this position, black is much better because this will be a long-term weakness. And if we go just back to the beginning of this position, right? In this position, right, you have a pawn on b2 and a3 and c4. And it's like one island, and if white had time, they could play a move like b3, then the pawn on c4 is defended by another pawn. But after, what happens, right? This pawn on c4 can never be protected again by another pawn, because this pawn structure has been splintered and will be a vulnerability for the rest of the game. So another very powerful example of damaging the pawn structure, but also showing that these bishops have long legs and they need space. And in order for them to be activated, we have to take pawns out of the position. We have to remove the pawns. And this is a typical way, right? So if you look at this position, we have a mini pawn chain, and we like to attack it at the base. And the base of this pawn chain is the pawn on g7. So we advance our pawn to kick the bishop goes away, and we push the pawn h6. And thereby we are going to worsen the black pawn structure. So after g takes h6, we take our pawn back, and now these two pawns have become a major weakness. So we can start targeting them. At the moment, of course, black has to react to the bishop on f6 attacking the rook on h8. So after rook g8, right, white starts attacking those weaknesses. Black can defend for one moment, the bishop retreats, and black can even add an attack on an attacker on the pawn on g3. White easily defends, and now we can also see suddenly what has happened by opening up the position, right? We have those bishops covering so many squares. They have such increased activity because the pawns have disappeared. And we saw this with the rook when we played f4 in two positions, but here we see it again with the two bishops, that if we get rid of pawns and the bishops get to cover more squares, they have much more activity and they're much more powerful. And in this case, the rook on g6 has no more squares left and is actually lost. It will be taken by a bishop on the next move. Okay, let me conclude with this one, right? So this is an example where you could say damaging the pawn structure and activating the piece go hand in hand, right? So black is to move, and white gives up their bishop by playing bishop takes b3, and after c takes b3, black plays their bishop to the square d4, and this square d4 is called an outpost because it cannot be controlled or attacked by a pawn anymore. And in this case, because black doesn't have a dark squared bishop, this will be a knight that will be there for the rest of the game if black wants to. I mean, of course, white could give up there a rook for it, but it cannot be challenged by another knight or bishop, and it cannot be challenged by a pawn. So if you go back to the original position, right, black has a knight on f8, and the pawn structure, right, all the pawns of white are connected, right? So there is only one island, you could say. So, but after bishop takes b3, c takes b3, knight e6, b4, knight d4, white has two pawn islands, right? And in the long term, d3 might be a weakness, b2 can be a weakness, right? And this knight on d4 is now in enemy territory and is looking to many squares, so has a lot of influence and cannot be challenged, right? So the knight has been activated and is on a strong square. And this is a way, when there are no direct threats in a position, to improve your play, and then you can start targeting the weaknesses in white's position. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you subscribe and like this video. Thank you.